The subcommittee will come to order. Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs meets today in conjunction with the House Task Force on American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia to continue its oversight of the administration's efforts to close the last remaining chapter of our involvement in Indochina, the nearly 2,500 American servicemen and civilians still missing and unaccounted for in Southeast Asia. Since I last chaired a hearing on POW MIAs, a great deal has taken place. The United States government successfully negotiated with the Lao government the joint excavation of the Pak Se crash site. This diplomatic breakthrough is extremely encouraging, and I commend both the U.S. and Lao officials involved in the excavation. The agreement in principle between our two governments to work toward improved relations is positively affected by such cooperation. It is the subcommittee's hope that a sustained pattern of progress will develop to further this process. It remains my belief that this issue can be resolved only through this type of government-to-government cooperation. Earlier this year, a high-level delegation led by Richard Childress of the National Security Council and accompanied by Ann Mills Griffith of the National League of Families conducted comprehensive negotiations regarding a joint excavation with Vietnamese Foreign Minister Tak and other officials. During their discussions, the Vietnamese agreed to increase the number of technical-level meetings from 4 to at least 6 per year. Perhaps most encouraging, Hanoi returned to the U.S. shortly after the delegation visit the remains of 6 American military personnel previously listed as missing. The Central Identification Laboratory positively identified the 6 and the remains were repatriated. Notably, 2 of the 6 had been listed by the Provisional Revolutionary Government as having died in captivity in the South, and their return signals the initial step in fulfilling Foreign Minister Tak's earlier pledge to focus efforts on these cases as well as those in the Hanoi-Haiphong area. These recent developments are welcomed and indeed encouraging. However, what is more important is whether they signal a policy decision in Hanoi to respond fully to the expressed desire of the American people, the Congress, and the administration to remove this issue as an obstacle between us. As President Reagan said in Alabama earlier this month, relations between the governments of Vietnam and Laos will not improve unless and until this issue is resolved. The President has declared the resolution of the issues involving our missing servicemen a matter of the highest national priority. Congress concurs with the emphasis and importance he places on this issue. Just last week, I rose with my distinguished colleagues, Mr. Solomon and Mr. Gilman, the chairman and vice chairman of the task force on POW MIAs, along with our very distinguished colleagues, Mr. McCain and Mr. Lagomarsino, to speak in favor of a bill designating July 19, 1985 National POW MIA Recognition Day. Such events are not just ceremonies, but serve to reaffirm our dedication to the issue and signal Hanoi of our unity and shared objectives. Last month, we met with former POW Robert Garwood and took formal testimony from him this morning. We have invited this afternoon former Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Eugene Tai, now retired, to provide his views. And we look forward to hearing from 3 high-level administration witnesses who share a direct responsibility for implementing U.S. policy in a continuing attempt to lend our support to efforts to bring home our missing. Congressman Gilman has sponsored, and I have co-sponsored, a bill that would express the sense of Congress that the President should work for the immediate release of any Americans who may still be held captive in Indochina and to secure further cooperation of the governments of Laos and Vietnam. The subcommittee has been and continues to be dedicated to ensuring that our government treats this issue as a national priority and commits the necessary resources to achieve a satisfactory resolution. What have been the developments over the past year? What are the prospects for continued cooperation? Are adequate resources available and used by the appropriate agencies? Are all reports vigorously and comprehensively pursued? What, if any, additional steps remain to be taken toward a full accounting of POW MIAs? It is the answers to these and other questions which we will be seeking this afternoon. Today, we have representatives from the Departments of State and Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency to answer these questions, brief us on recent developments, and give us their evaluation and prognosis. We will first hear from General Eugene Tai, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who served this nation honorably and well, and who, in his previous incarnation as the head of the DIA, testified before this subcommittee on, I believe, a number of occasions. In recent months, General Tai has made a number of statements, including one that I personally saw on national television, which relate to this issue and which raise some very, very serious and profound questions and concerns about the fate of those Americans who are still missing in Indochina. And consequently, we have invited him to be our lead-off witness today. He has always spoken in the past with great candor and with conviction. He is, I believe, a man of unquestioned integrity, and I deeply appreciate, General Tai, your willingness to be with us voluntarily this afternoon. It appears that not every witness who comes before our committee does so voluntarily. And we've been in permanent session, actually, since 10 o'clock this morning, taking private testimony from Mr. Garwood. We will resume that session after the recess, since we had a number of questions we didn't have time to get to. But we do appreciate your willingness to be with us today, and we look forward, sir, to receiving your testimony. Before you proceed, would anybody like to make a comment? Yeah. Mr. Solomon.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, let me just be very, very brief, because we do have the Defense Authorization Bill on the floor. The time is really pressing today, and I will not give my opening statement. I just want to thank General Tai for coming. He's widely respected in his field, and we certainly appreciate him being here today. And again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding these hearings. As chairman of the task force on POW-MIAs, I think we are making progress, and certainly today is going to help us in those efforts. So I just want to commend you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Any further comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Gilman.
I just want to join with our chairman on our task force in extending our appreciation to you for arranging this early hearing. I'm pleased to see that there are representatives from the National League of Families here with us today, Mr. Brooks and some of the other executive members. We are particularly concerned, General Tai, we welcome you before our hearing to try to evolve any further steps that this committee should be undertaking and to properly evaluate what has come before us up to date, and we certainly welcome your expertise. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gilman. General Tai, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to testify on POW-MIAs in Southeast Asia. And let me preface my remarks and my answers to the questions to which you have asked that I respond in the same words with which I have answered all of my questioners, including those from the media, since 1 September 1981. Quote, I retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency on 1 September 1981. Since that time, I have not been involved with the POW-MIA activities of the Defense Intelligence Agency, nor had access to DIA's current data on POW-MIA matters. I suggest you address your questions to the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in whom I have complete confidence, unquote. And I want to preface my remarks in that same way to this group today. I remain very interested in the matter of prisoners of war who are still missing as a result of combat in Southeast Asia and Korea, and particularly in those who may have held or may be held against their will there. I'm heartened by the significant interest and support the government of the United States devotes to this issue. I'm impressed that the media and organizations such as the National League of Families and other organizations keep high American interest in this important issue, as the President has asked of us all. The earliest possible return of American military held against their will in Southeast Asia, some of whom Hanoi may say do not wish to return, and of the remains of those who perished there, must remain of immense importance to every American. There are no more important matters for the Congress to consider than these in which you are engaged today. But like the consideration of all hostage matters, whether in Iran or Southeast Asia or in Lebanon, this prolonged issue is frustrating for every American. The government faces a most difficult challenge. Patience wears thin, and where leverage is difficult to find, all kinds of suggestions for action rise to confront us. Most are wholly impractical. Many are the products of self-serving. Many come from the naive but well-meaning. All must be listened to respectfully, for public awareness is very important. The issue is a vital governmental issue. It must remain the government's issue. Only the government can solve it. No one non-governmental agency or organization is responsible, and turf must not be the item for discussion. The issue is people, live people, and the remains of some who perished in the service of their country. I have, during the years, received some harsh criticism for my activities regarding the POW-MIA problem and some generous praise, and so have most public officials who have been sufficiently involved to be identified with the cause. I'm sure none would believe their efforts in vain. I will continue to do anything I can to help resolve the issue. As to the specific answers to specific questions which I was asked to respond, in the interest of time, I'd like to go first to the question that has to do with what I suggest that the Congress might do, and I'll read the question. As to what can the Congress do to resolve this issue, and what should Congress be doing that it is not already doing to pressure Hanoi to cooperate? As to what Congress should be doing that is not already, I've always had the greatest respect for the support this subcommittee has given the problem of resolving the fate of our POWs and MIAs. I was given to understand throughout my tenure at DIA that you stood ready to do anything within your power to assist in the resolution of the problem. I have every reason to believe that attitude has prevailed, your degree of support enhanced. I would hope the Oversight Committee chairman of both the Senate and the House would regularly seek out detailed and specific reports on the precise collection efforts underway to assure that the government is able to resolve the bulk of the sightings of live Americans still held in Southeast Asia. I would also hope that the Congress would support my recommendation, which was mentioned in Bill Paul's 24 April item in the Wall Street Journal, that the entire responsibility for resolving the POW-MIA issue, that is for analysis and action, be turned over by the President to a permanent commission on prisoner of war missing in action affairs. Such a commission, manned with talented investigators and analysts and overseen by distinguished government, civic, and academic personnel to include members from both aisles of the Congress, could take over the responsibility for the analysis of the current database, for levying collection requirements on the U.S. intelligence community, and for determining the means for necessary action. Such a commission would endure beyond administrations, remove doubt around the country and the concern of mothers, wives, and other family members that the issue will not be allowed to go away. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General Tai. We now have a vote on the Foley Amendment, which is underway. I suggest that we also have, I suggest we recess the hearing for 15 minutes. That will give us a chance not only to vote, but to get a candy bar or something. None of us have had any lunch today. And we will resume at approximately 2:20. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Bill Outlaw with the Washington Times. I know a fair amount of stuff on this. In fact, I've been anxious to talk to you. Do you have, first off, the reference you just made, is that mentioned in your prepared text here?
What's this?
About the commission that you just called for?
Have I mentioned it before? I mentioned it in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, you did mention that. Okay. It is mentioned here. Okay. Maybe I looked past it there.
This time of the presence in the room today of a very distinguished member of the New York City Council who was a veteran of our involvement in Vietnam, Jay O'Donovan, who also represents part of the congressional district I'm privileged to represent here in Washington, and I want to welcome him to our proceedings. Jay, it's good to have you. General, do you want to proceed with your testimony?
If you'd like, I'll continue to read the questions that you've asked that I respond to and my answers, and/or you may want to question me directly, Mr. Chairman.
Well, why don't we go straight to the question, since I've had a chance to read your testimony. I gather from what you said that you think it would be useful to establish some kind of a commission to review this whole area.
A permanent presidential commission which would have access to all of the records that the government has on this particular issue, be able directly to levy collection requirements on the intelligence agencies and get direct responses from them, and at the same time have access to as prestigious a group of Americans as you could possibly imagine to satisfy the concerns of many of the organizations that are dealing with this
in
issue.
view of the fact that we've already had 2 commissions look into this, one of them, I think, a select congressional committee. I think there was another commission. The DIA has been going about its business. This subcommittee has been conducting periodic oversight hearings. What do you see as the need for such a commission, and what would that commission be able to do that isn't already being done?
First of all, a permanent commission would resolve the issue on a permanent basis rather than going away and or changing with each election. The confidence certainly in a permanent commission is that you've got the same group doing the analysis that is responsible to recommend action directly to the president and overseeing it if it's of a sensitive diplomatic nature, containing all of this activity in one house, as it were, on a permanent basis so that it can have the benefit of continuity and the constant attention of outside interests to the analysis that's being done.
Do you have any reason to believe that elements of the executive branch or of the Congress are engaged in a cover-up on this issue?
Absolutely not.
Do you think that adequate resources are being devoted to the problem in the executive branch right now?
I'm more concerned with the fragmentation of the activities that are going on and the need for an overall supervision in one house, as it were, than scattered around the government of the United States.
But you're not suggesting then that there's a lack of resources, that more people are needed. It's rather a question of coordination and of continuity.
Coordination and continuing central direction of the activities to include all of the activities regarding recovery of remains and the living.
Well, DIA, of course, is responsible for the intelligence collection, and I suppose state...
DIA is responsible, sir, excuse me, for the analysis and levying collection. Most of the collection activities have to be done by other agencies.
You said in your interview on ABC News on May 7th, and I'm now quoting, "It was inevitable, for me at least, to draw the conclusions that there were indeed Americans still in Vietnam, and the conclusion that they weren't there because they wanted to be." What was it about the evidence available to you that made such a conclusion, in your own words, inevitable?
The intelligence business is one of putting pieces together and over a long period of time getting a certain amount of confidence in one or the other type of source or source. The human reporting that came out of Southeast Asia on live Americans held there against their will was among the most detailed of human reporting I've ever seen. And I've said before this subcommittee and task force before that if we had that quality of human reporting, and this was coming from friends by and large, on the Soviet Union, our knowledge of what's going on in the way of detailed planning and strategy in the Soviet Union would be rather immense. It is high quality human intelligence. It was high quality while I was the director of DIA. I cannot forget it. it is still a part of my database.
You're talking here, I gather, about the live sightings that
Yes, sir.
that were reported. And those live sighting reports numbered, what, in the hundreds or the thousands?
They were in the hundreds while I was still director. I don't know what they, how they were resolved.
But my impression is that of the hundreds of live sighting reports, there were only a handful where the individuals who gave us the reports took polygraph tests where the polygraph tests indicated that they were being truthful.
With all due respect, I doubt that the majority of the live sighting reports have led us to the direct polygraphing of the total number of citees, if you can say that.
I'm not sure that I understood that,
I
General.
doubt that we've been able to polygraph but a fraction of the total of the reporters.
But most of the people who have been polygraphed did not pass the polygraph test when you were in charge of DIA, or
Not to my knowledge, those we had very few that we were able to polygraph, and my memory serves me, the reporting was very accurate.
So your recollection then is, A, that most of the refugees who gave us live sighting reports were not polygraphed, but of those who were, a majority turned out, at least according to the polygraph results, to be telling the truth.
I think that came to us in the way of unresolved reports.
Yeah. General, I'm afraid that we'll have to temporarily postpone this colloquy and this question and answer session for a few minutes. These are the second bells on a vote on a pending amendment. As soon as I come back, we'll resume.
Can I talk to you for a couple
What's your name?
I'm Walt Morissette. I'm with Army Times.
Oh, are you?
Right. Army Times News Service. We're trying to understand why there is all this commotion about Garwood sightings now, even though he's been back to Vietnam since '79. And do you believe that what he allegedly said to the closed session of the subcommittee
I've
today?
never talked to Garwood. I don't know him. I haven't listened to his press conferences. You'd better talk to those people to find out why they're interested. But I presume that he's saying things now that he didn't say before. And I would suggest, if you recall, that when he was talking before, he was under indictment, facing the court martial, and you may talk a little bit different on that.
The subcommittee will come to order. General Tai, you indicated in your ABC interview that you thought there were 50 to 60 people that were still alive in Vietnam, Americans who were there being held against their will. How did you arrive at that particular calculation? I mean, why 50 rather than 5 or 500?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I should have been the last person ever to have been talked into revealing or talking about a number, because I've tried to resist that down through the years. I think it doesn't do all that much service to the issue. I based my suggestion that there may be somewhere in that ballpark number there on my memory of three rather more precise live sighting reports than any others at three locations in Vietnam. The numbers added up at that time to somewhere between 50 and 60.
And now, your conclusions are not based on any intelligence or information you've received subsequent to your departure from?
None whatsoever. As I said, I left the database behind when I retired, and I have confidence in people that have it today.
Right. Now, the President has said that this is a matter of the highest national priority. Do you believe that his administration has in fact made it a matter of the highest national
Yes, sir,
priority?
I do.
You do. And do you believe that the individuals who are working on this in DIA are genuinely dedicated to the search for the truth here?
I think very much so. I would suggest that it's very difficult over a long number of years that the people there that have had this work to do to maintain a fairly high level of enthusiasm on occasion. And I would suggest that there is a possibility of some fatigue setting in from time to time, and that's a matter that has to be constantly looked at.
In determining the veracity of the refugee and live sighting reports, how much significance do you attribute to polygraph tests?
I think polygraph is very, very useful, and if properly administered in the language, of course, that's required, provided it is administered in a non-threatening environment.
Now, what would be your feeling about the credibility of an individual who claimed to have seen personally American POWs on a number of occasions and who was asked to take a polygraph test, which would be limited just to those allegations, but who refused to take one?
As to the testimony he gave, I'd have much less confidence in it.
Right. Now, are you aware that Mr. Garwood has so far refused to take a polygraph test?
No, I'm not. I have never talked with him.
Well, he has, in fact, refused to do so unless all of the other witnesses before our committee take polygraph tests as well. I informed him that, so far as we knew, you were not a convicted collaborator, nor were any of the other witnesses. But would his continued unwillingness to take a polygraph test lead you to discount his allegations?
I'd have no way of putting him in the plus column, Mr. Chairman, unless I could really feel that he had leveled with the interrogators. And his refusal to take that polygraph test, unless I could find some legal basis for it or something that had to do with his continued jeopardy in a legal sense, I would be inclined to discount it.
Now, he told us that he had revealed to his psychiatrist and to at least one of his attorneys some, although not all, of the information he subsequently disclosed publicly concerning POWs. We have asked him if he would authorize his psychiatrists and his attorneys to discuss with us what he had told them about POWs, making it clear that our inquiries would be limited solely to what he had told them about POWs and would not touch on his private life, his family background, his fantasies, dreams, resentments, or whatever. And he has taken that under advisement. Now, if he refuses to authorize them to disclose that information to us, what conclusions would this lead you to draw with respect to his credibility?
As to his lawyer, I probably wouldn't be quite so surprised as if he refused to let his psychiatrist talk with you. For those same reasons, he may have some reason not to want the lawyer to talk with you.
What could that be?
I don't know whether or not he's going to be presenting some kind of an additional appeal or something on which he may be relying for the future. I have no way of knowing that, but that could possibly be.
And if he refused to permit his psychiatrist to speak to us?
Then again, my confidence in him would begin to lag again. I can't imagine why he would have any objection to that.
And that, in combination with his refusal to take a polygraph, would that lead you to conclude that his testimony was worthless?
Not necessarily worthless, but certainly shouldn't be considered for any subsequent action.
Right. Mr. Leach.
First, Mr. Chairman, could I have a clarification? Am I right in assuming we're not to discuss any of the testimony that was delivered this morning? Am I right to assess that you're occupied with other matters at the moment, Mr. Chairman? Am I right to assess that
The chair is preoccupied. Mr. Chairman?
Forgive me, I was missing in action for a moment.
Just a query. Am I right to assume that the testimony this morning is out of bounds for discussion this afternoon?
In specific terms.
Well, let me just turn to a couple areas that relate to some of the things that you have a long background in. And one is a question before this committee on the likelihood of POW MIAs missing in Laos as contrasted with Vietnam. Do you distinguish the two countries? Do you feel there's greater evidence for one than the other? What is your own assessment of that situation?
I don't distinguish. Perhaps I should be more careful in distinguishing, but I believe that the Vietnamese government has sufficient control over the geography of Laos. So when I talk about the area, I talk about Southeast Asia rather than Vietnam or Laos.
Do you have any belief, though, that there is a greater or lesser likelihood of POW MIAs missing in action from a Laotian setting of combat?
I have no way of balancing numbers again as to which is the greater. I do believe, however, that Vietnam would not be above stashing them any place if they chose in Southeast Asia.
You have on page 3 of your testimony, you have at the conclusion of paragraph A the statement, "I have tried to avoid getting into the numbers game, but there may be many more alive there. But the 50-60 was based in my memory of 3 areas of particularly convincing sightings." Are you referring to 3 incidents for which there's some
3
evidence?
separate geographic areas where we had live sighting reports.
Is any of that based in any way on the Garwood testimony?
None.
On page 4 of your testimony, you contain the statement, "Formal diplomatic recognition of Vietnam and Laos may not be inconceivable." Are you suggesting that we ought to be recognizing Vietnam and Laos at this time?
I have no doubt that eventually the United States will reestablish normal diplomatic relations with Hanoi, and my suggestion is that it may not be impossible to work on that principle if you're going to get the leverage that you need over that country to regain our missing and live
So you're
Americans.
advocating recognition as a helpful technique of resolving this issue?
As much as it pains me to advocate normal diplomatic recognition with Hanoi, I'd certainly do it to retrieve one live American.
Finally, let me just ask you, you made a suggestion in your testimony and earlier before the press that we ought to consider forming a permanent commission on prisoner of war missing in action affairs. You also have indicated in this testimony that the most promising hope of accounting and potential recovery is through diplomatic means. One of the disadvantages of commissions is that they're a step removed from the administration in terms of the diplomatic element. Does that strike you as an inconsistency or something that is just not of overly great
No, not at all. I think with proper representation to that commission from each of the elements of government, we could have even a much tighter control over what actions were taken, both diplomatically and otherwise.
Well, thank you, General. I appreciate very much your comments and your service and the careful way you've explained your position.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Tai, I somewhat feel the way you do as far as if it were possible to bring home even one to recognize Hanoi, that would hurt me deeply to have to do that. But along that line of thought, is it not true then that if there are live prisoners over there, and I believe there are, that they are in effect being held hostage for the United States government to recognize Hanoi?
Knowing the way the communist or other totalitarian governments operate, I would suggest that may be very well one of the reasons they're held. There could be others.
Well, I think that's obvious to many of us. As a matter of fact, you can go back to the Second World War and look at how long it took the Soviet Union at that time to repatriate prisoners and to even account for them, and many times they didn't. In the Korean War back in my days, the same situation held true. North Korea never did account for them. And I don't think there's any question that that's what's happening now. Let me get to a pointed question, because as chairman of the task force on the POW MIAs, I've come under some criticism from some people, as has Ben Gilman, the former chairman of this task force, as has Steve Solars, the chairman of the subcommittee, as has President Reagan, and as has the DIA, come under consideration that there's a cover-up going on. In your opinion, you've known members of the task force, you've known the subcommittee, and you've known certainly the President of the United States and the DIA. Is there, in your opinion, any kind of a cover-up, governmental cover-up going on, or
No,
has
sir.
there ever been?
No, sir. I think the only time you would certainly want not to publicize what you're up to is when you're up to something that might be beneficial in the return of either remains or live.
Well, that brings me to my last comment or question, and it's too bad that we can't let the American public know sometimes the means at our disposal for our government to gather intelligence information. And that's always very difficult, because intelligence by its very nature is covert, and should be, or else it will not be effective. And I would really like to ask you, but not have you answer, I guess, what means we have at our disposal for gathering information about the POWs that might possibly still be there and the remains. And I'm hopeful that at some future time, perhaps the Chairman Solars will have you come before us, or certainly even sit down with us in private to perhaps discuss that.
I would like to respond to that as I can, and that's simply to say that all intelligence collection is based on priorities. And priorities, or shall I say budgets and actions, follow thereupon. And it's simply a matter of putting a great deal of resources into the problem, in my judgment, and then making sure we follow up on every little action that we take to procure a verification of a report and or an on-scene discussion with some of the individuals concerned in Vietnam.
Well, General, I've got a lot of other questions, but I know it's getting late. We do have a very important bill on the floor, and I just want to thank you for your past performance in your capacities. You're certainly outstanding, and we appreciate your coming here today to testify for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, you alluded to this in response to questions already, but let me ask you again, why would, because this is a thing that most people who are not acquainted with the Vietnamese and with the way things work in that area, or with communists for that matter, always ask, why would Vietnam hold prisoners this many years after the war ended? What would be in it for them? Why would they do that? What is your...
You know, trying to understand them, I recall having read or seen someplace a report of a speech that Mark Clark made in 1954. He went back to Italy after he'd come out of Korea, and he went back to Italy to dedicate some kind of a monument or other. And he said he'd never run into an enemy like he ran into in Korea and China, an enemy that killed our wounded as they lay begging for mercy, refused to admit that they held Americans hostage even after we rescued some from their captivity, and who at that time, as I recall, still retained over 3,000 live Americans, which he claimed at that time had never been returned or accounted for. So trying to understand why these people do as they do and act as they do is beyond my pale. I can only tell you that their mores
and their moral judgments are far different than the Judeo-Christian ethic that we're apparently dealing with here.
If it's for the reason that they would trade them for assistance, you, in order to do that, you have to say you have them. You can't trade something for nothing. How would they ever, this is the thing that really blows my mind, is how would they ever be able to explain how come they just suddenly discovered they were there now that they...
Well, you know, they seem to discover a few more remains every once in a while, and I have great confidence in the reporting that they have a very large number, over 400 sets of remains, all prepared, properly identified, and ready for return to the United States. And I think that's something that we have to remember when they return 1 or 2 or 3 sets.
Do you have, or can you recall, strong evidence that there might be non-prisoner ex-members of the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia?
Do I understand that non-military?
Yes. People
prisoners?
who have remained there, like Garwood is alleged to have been, convicted of being, I guess. You know, deserters, people who...
I don't have any doubt that among those that are still alive, you'd probably find some that would be so branded or have been branded by the Hanoi government to the point where they believe it themselves. Some may or some may not be there as deserters, and of course we've had some evidence that there are deserters there.
Okay, Mr. Garwood was released during the time that you served as director.
Yes, sir.
And you were director for some time prior to that also. What can you tell us about reports that your agency had on him during that time?
We had various and sundry reports of Caucasians sighted in the Hanoi area, and as I recall, and I could be corrected by DIA people here today, nothing that pointed specifically to him or where he was subsequently located.
But there were reports of someone who fitted his general...
We had a number of sightings of Caucasians on the streets of Hanoi, yes.
I gather from what you say in your testimony, only the government, when you say only the government can solve it, that in spite of the fact that you're talking about a permanent commission, you're not talking about a non-governmental approach to solving this problem.
No, the government commission might recommend to the president that a non-governmental activity of some kind be undertaken, but it would be strictly an element of the government performing.
Do you think there's any, assuming that the live Americans were found and it was determined that diplomacy was not the right way to go for whatever reason to effect their release, and it was determined that there should be some kind of operation to get them out, I gather that you would not suggest a Rambo-like effort here.
Well, I haven't seen the movie,
I haven't either.
but I would suggest that either the DCI or the Secretary of Defense could come up with an adequate means to extract them if they had a precise location.
Now, you left the agency before, I guess before, or at the time, perhaps it was not before, but about at the time that President Reagan was making this a higher priority, if I might say, than it had been before that time. More facilities and more assets have been devoted to the effort than was the case during most of your tenure. Does that, the fact that that's true, and as I recall, Mr. Gilman can verify this, it's my recollection that every recommendation made by the task force to the administration for upgrading the facilities available and helping out was adopted. With all of that in mind, do you still think that the creation of a private commission or a separate commission would be helpful from the standpoint of having more assets available, or are you thinking primarily
Let me answer that in this way, Mr. Logmarcino. The awareness campaign that has accelerated down through the recent years has brought into the scene a great number of organizations, all of whom are equally and intensely as interested. But it also brings up a great deal of doubt and challenges and a lot of, if I can say, charges of cover-up and so forth. And my view is that a coordinated effort by a permanent commission reporting directly to the president
can put to bed a great many of those concerns and also bring back to the apparent awareness of everyone that this is a government issue and that no one organization can go out and solve the problem itself, including a Rambo on his own or anyone else.
Thank you.
Mr. Gilman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly welcome having General Ty before us once again. He certainly was helpful to us while he was serving in his capacity as in being in charge of this issue years gone by. General Ty, I'm concerned about some of the quotations that appeared in a Wall Street Journal article that were attributed to you, and you try to answer part of that in your testimony. Do you still feel there's a mindset to debunk in the intelligence agencies that we have with regard to MIA POW information?
And I certainly don't want to indict anyone in this process at all, but I would suggest I've run into that mindset before. Some of the people with whom I worked and who, in my judgment, held that mindset are still around. And it goes throughout the government. I don't necessarily want to criticize all of them because everyone has their own opinions, is entitled to them. But if their jobs directly deal with trying to resolve the veracity and the accuracy of a specific live sighting report, then it bothers me a bit. I don't know that the mindset exists today, but I'd be very surprised on the part of several people if it didn't.
While you were in charge of the agency, did you do anything to try to turn that around? That kind of
regularly and as much as I could, sir. And I think in that regard, we did largely through the efforts of your task force turn around a great many mindsets in that way.
Now, with further regard to some of the portions of your testimony, you talked about those 50 American military personnel still alive in Vietnam. Was that based on any specific information? Was
those were live,
a gut feeling?
Based on live sighting reports, which we were not able, as you're well aware, most of those reports we have no way of resolving unless we go in and invade and or get a human source in whom we have great confidence, specifically to check the area and the subject itself. It is my feeling that those were very factual reports, and they were the basis for my testimony before this committee before, and I have no reason to believe they aren't still true.
Have you had an opportunity, let's see, how long have you been out of the agency?
3 years.
Have you had an opportunity to get updated on those 50 to 60 cases?
I'm not too sure that it's necessary at all to have to update me, and I have had no updating since.
So at this point, you really don't know what's occurred in a 3-year period?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you have any recommendations, if any of those cases are still open and questionable, of what we could do to verify?
Well, the one thing that I recommended is that we pay very, very close attention to and request an accounting from each of the intelligence agencies that's given a specific collection requirement against the veracity of each of those live sighting reports. And when I say that, I think it's important for both the oversight committees of the Congress to regularly have that as a very high priority item, and that they pass the results of their queries directly to you.
Well, I understand that would be a good recommendation with regard to pinpointing which cases are out there that are questionable. But what I'm asking, General Ty, is once having defined the questionable cases, what can we do better than we're doing today to try to get to the heart of those cases?
Well, of course, if I am not updated, I don't want to criticize that of which I know nothing.
Well, let's assume that there are 50 hard cases out there.
Let's assume there are unresolved live sighting reports. And my first suggestion is that we get a primary collector right in the area, and each area concerned.
Now, what's a primary collector for those of us who are...
a human being in whom we have the very greatest confidence, who is able to view for himself what is or isn't there.
All right, assume we get a primary collector and get some additional information. What are your thoughts then?
Then I think there comes a time when you have to use whatever proof he comes back to apprise the public of what you know and or having exhausted all your diplomatic negotiation with Hanoi, make it public to the world and look for the world judgments to help you out.
General Tai, while you were in the office with those responsibilities, were you able to utilize any of those prime collectors?
During my time, we never had a prime collector on any one of those live sightings.
Is there some reason why that was
This
difficult?
isn't any easy task. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of priorities, but you'll recall that for years, our priorities on Southeast Asia after we got out of there were very, very low. As you would expect, there wasn't a great deal of interest in Southeast Asia after the conclusion of hostilities there.
Is a prime collector proposition something we're capable of doing at the
Yes, sir.
present time? Do you know whether we're doing any of that at the
I
present
don't know,
time?
and I wouldn't expect to know.
Do you have any other recommendations to our committee for doing more than we have been doing, or
Only-
making certain that the
Only
agencies...
keep your interest up. I applaud it, and it's good to see you all still working this problem very hard. It's something that will not go away or be resolved quickly. It's something that has to be kept on the front burner and of high priority, as the President said.
While you were in your, how many years were you assuming that office in charge of the MIA?
I was deputy director, acting director, and director for a period of about 7 years.
During that 7-year period, did you find any lack of support from the administrations that you served under?
I think awareness is what brought growing support for our activities, as you can imagine, where we've gone from a period of no interest after the return of our homecoming manpower. And it had to be built on an accumulation of the reports, which came as they started to, the refugees started to flow out of Southeast Asia.
Was there any time when you found resistance at the top when you took your requests up?
Some of the mindsets of which I speak were included in people in high positions at that time, yes.
And as you neared the end of your responsibilities in that office, were you finding good cooperation with the
Everywhere.
administration? Thank you, General Tyan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McCain. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, time goes late. I'll try and be brief, and I hope you'll try to be brief in your answers. I appreciate your dedication to this effort a great deal. First of all, I was heartened to hear you say that, to your knowledge and belief, there has never been any cover-up, intentional cover-up on the part of this administration or any other administration. Is that correct?
Correct.
You also believe that it is worse than futile to mount amateur, privately financed efforts at the location or retrieving of alleged live POWs?
I feel that very strongly.
Thank you, sir. I think you would agree with me that some people have been preyed upon by these so-called rescuers and invested a great deal of money as well as emotional capital into these efforts, all of which have turned out to be fruitless. Is that your information as well?
It is, and I've had regular calls throughout all the years since I left DIA asking my advice or recommendation on this or that or the other activity, and have vetoed each of them in turn.
And I thank you very much for that, General. I think you've saved even more heartache and pain because of your firm commitment to that. Concerning the poor analyses, you mentioned that there was a mindset while you were there and afterwards that at least was not totally open towards information and live sightings, and that there were live sightings that you felt were not resolved while you were serving as director. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
I would hope that we would be able to, since you have followed this issue very closely, perhaps arrange some kind of meeting to find out what has happened to these live sightings and what follow-up has been made since you left the agency, because I'm afraid we are going to hear witnesses from the administration that are going to tell us that these live sightings have been fully investigated and put to rest. It might be of value if we could have some kind of meeting in the minds here, so where not only could we hope to resolve some of these, but the present director of the DIA and others might take advantage of your 7 years of experience on this issue, which I think is in many ways invaluable. Speaking of the subject of recognition or non-recognition of Vietnam, I'm sure you're aware we do have normal relations or diplomatic relations with Laos, who are nothing more than a puppet of the Vietnamese government. The thing that concerns me about the recognition of the Vietnamese government is, one, as you know, that was about to take place until the invasion of Cambodia, and the decision was made by the Carter administration, which I supported, not to show approval of that action by not going through with diplomatic relations. They're still in Cambodia, number one. Number two is we have an Amerasian problem of some 20,000 children, and in addition to that, there are estimates, and you may have a better number than I do, 20 to 50,000 former Vietnamese government and military officers in re-education camps. Aren't you afraid that recognition to the Vietnamese government would somehow constitute an endorsement or allowance or our acceptance of a status quo as far as those other issues are concerned?
I would suggest there may be a time when, since we aren't resolving them either satisfactorily, and certainly not the Cambodian situation, where we have no choice but to sit down as equal partners and make some demands on them, which may or may not be successful. But here we're talking about last resort situation, Congressman.
I have felt for a long time that this administration should explore the possibility of a special interest section, such as the Cubans have with us, in order to establish some kind of dialogue and yet possibly not extend full recognition. And I hope that the administration will explore that option without either you or I trying to tell the administration how they should conduct foreign policy. With regard to Mr. Garwood, very briefly, you mentioned, I was interested, reports of a Caucasian on the streets of Hanoi. Was that Caucasian under guard that you heard the...
My memory isn't all that good, Congressman, but I would suggest that we had reports of Caucasians not under guard, as well as guarded Caucasians in Hanoi.
Thank you. As regards to the setting up of a commission, which you have at least to a certain degree, endorsed, do you feel that this commission would then relieve the Congress of its duties, such as this task force and other activities that are going on, or do you feel that it would be supplementary to what this committee is doing?
I think it would include all the elements of the executive department, but I'm not at all sure that you would ever want to consider doing away with the activities of the subcommittee and or of their task force on this issue.
I was very interested in your avocation of a, quote, primary collector, and I will finish with this question, Mr. Chairman. Isn't it extremely difficult to in place a, quote, primary collector in a country such as particularly the northern part of Vietnam, where most of the allegations have taken place of live sightings, in such a heavily controlled society that where virtually everyone is watched and examined? Wouldn't this be very, very difficult to...
I think it's very, very difficult, but it's certainly not as difficult there as it is in many other parts of the world where we're successful.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. General, we have a bit of a problem, and I hope you can help us out. I'm sure that our colleagues here who haven't had a chance to ask you any questions yet have some questions they would like to ask. At the same time, Secretary Wolfowitz has to leave for an important meeting at 4. What I would like to propose, if it's acceptable to you, and if my colleagues will agree as well, that you step aside. We ask the administration to come up now, and then when they leave, if you could come back, that would give the members who haven't had a chance to question you yet to put some questions to you. Is that acceptable, sir?
That's very, very acceptable, and one of the
If
privileges
there are
of
no
retirement.
objections from the other members of the committee, I hate to do this, but I think it is important for us to hear from Mr. Wolfowitz, and he does have to leave at 4. So at this point, we'll suspend the questioning of General Tai, which will be resumed after the administration witnesses are finished. And if someone can summon Mr. Wolfowitz for wherever he is, we will proceed with his testimony. Now, no, all of them. and also Mr. Kelly and Commodore Brooks. Paul, we understand you have to leave at 4, so we've asked General Ty to temporarily step aside, and he'll be available after you're finished, and the other administration witnesses.
I've adjusted my schedule now, so
Pardon?
I've adjusted my schedule now so I can stay longer, so I can do it whichever way you prefer.
Well, if you can stay longer, then why don't we just finish up with General Ty and... No? Yeah. No, we won't want to deliberately hear them first. Is there any other members who would like to ask any questions of General Ty? Okay. We will remain with the procedure we established this morning with members of the subcommittee, then members of the full committee, then other esteemed colleagues and visitors. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will keep it brief. General, you point out in answer to one of the questions posed to you in your testimony, and you said it again just a moment ago, that one of the best means available to us certainly has to be diplomatic channels. Can you tell the committee what overtures have been made to the United Nations, the International Red Cross, and other organizations of that kind to try to act as intermediaries to try to solve this problem?
No, I know of no overtures to the United Nations or the Red Cross in this regard. I would rely on my successors behind me here to answer that question more fully.
I would perhaps ask the chairman if he is aware of the UN getting involved in this kind of case at all to date, trying to solve a MIA question.
I am not in any specific sense, Mr. Smith, but that's a question I think that would appropriately be put to the administration witnesses.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back to balance.
Okay. Mr. DeWine, did you have any questions? Yeah. Mr. Hendon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, you indicated that polygraph is, I think you said, is very, very useful if administered correctly. Does DIA administer them correctly?
I'm not current on whether they do or they do not. I have had reported to me on occasion that there was a degree of terror present during polygraphing simply because of a lack of understanding as to what was going on. But by and large, I would say they're done very professionally.
If there was a degree of terror, I think your word, would that cause the witness to fail or to pass?
I think it's possible to cause him to fail.
I see, sir. There's obviously not unanimity of thought among members of Congress as to the veracity or the usefulness of polygraphs, as witnessed the vote that we had last night. But, General, if a witness passed 2 polygraphs and had intimate knowledge of the area where he said he saw American POWs, would you believe him?
Probably, yes.
You would, sir. General, if the DIA says he's a fabricator after passing 2 polygraph tests, and I know of 2 instances where this is taken place, then why is it that Mr. Garwood should take a polygraph test? Before you or anyone else will put him in, as you said, in the plus column.
There are 2
I mean, if we've got 2 and we don't believe that.
First off, we're talking about a hypothetical situation as opposed to directly talking about Mr. Garwood. I think, by the way, there are ways and means among very professional people to avoid the polygraph and or to subvert it. I would suggest that if there have been 2 positive polygraph tests that attested to a veracity of an individual who was subsequently debunked, there may be very professional reasons for saying that for other reasons. Now, as to the question of whether Mr. Garwood should be polygraphed, the big question, of course, is why not? Why would anyone being queried on specifically the testimony that he's giving and none other resist a polygraph? It's almost a negative type thing rather than a positive. Yes. You certainly aren't going to ascribe to him the professional touch that a fully trained espionage agent would have.
Of course not, sir. But what if someone came along with intimate knowledge of an area and said that they had seen POWs there, which was the exact same place that a person with intimate knowledge of the area passed 2 polygraphs saying that he saw POWs there. How would that build as a professional
Of course,
intelligence?
that builds to the conclusion that there's a great deal of veracity in both reports.
Whether or not he passes a polygraph or not, the
Well, of
second
course, you're
source.
talking about a second source there, and
You're talking about 2
He
sources.
builds on the veracity of the
So
first.
you've got a source who says he's seen POWs, hypothetically, and he passes 2 polygraphs and has intimate knowledge of the area. Along comes a second source, hypothetically, who has access to the area and says he saw POWs at the same place. That builds. That's what you're saying.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, General. Second question. You mentioned, and I agree with you, sir, that this president, you didn't say it this way, General, but I will, is the best friend these POWs ever had. Perhaps you would characterize it that way. I'll bet most of my colleagues would. It is a matter of the highest national priority. I'm convinced of that with the president. General, you mentioned the need for a presidential commission, which I think is a great idea. How would you modify your statements if you knew that there couldn't be or wouldn't be a presidential commission appointed? What would you say we should do then?
Well, of course, I don't believe any of my recommendations are infallible, so I would have to resign.
Yes, sir, but we
to the
respect
ba-
your
to the
judgment.
greater
That's why
good.
you're here.
I wouldn't change my testimony at all.
Yes, sir, but if I have proposed a commission, as my colleagues know, and perhaps many people here, an independent congressional commission, because like you and like my colleagues and like everybody in this room and everybody in America, I want to get to the bottom of this thing, not point any fingers at anybody, but just find out, are the men there, and what can we do to get them home? Now, if for some reason there is not going to be a presidential commission, what do we do then?
Well, there, of course.
What about a congressional commission,
You're going to rely, of course, on the president, who you said had made this his top priority, and if he doesn't choose to establish a presidential commission, that's his.
That's right.
Up to him. I am less enthusiastic, frankly, for a congressional commission for 2 reasons. One, you have a task force on the subject operative right now, and a very vigorous one. And secondly, my experience with the results and/or the closed effect of previous congressional commissions leads me to believe if we don't have a permanent one, we want to rely on the regular activities of the Congress.
I see, sir. So if we can't have a presidential commission, we stick with what we've got, in your opinion?
Yes,
That's
sir.
very important to me.
Yes, sir, I would suggest that.
General, you
Gentleman's
indicated...
time, the gentleman's time
Thank
is
you, Mr.
expired.
Chairman.
If you have another question, that would be fine, but
It's
otherwise
a very,
I'd like...
very, very brief question,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate your indulgence. I am obviously not on the committee, but I am on the task force, and I'm very grateful. General, you indicated nothing could be done about those 3 reports, or maybe I misunderstood you, but we all have a sense of frustration that, you know, it's a tough question. How are we going to get these men home? You indicated, I think you indicated, sir, that you know, you sense frustration. You know, those 3 particular sightings, we couldn't do anything about them. Am I misinterpreting what you said?
No, I didn't. I wouldn't say that at all.
All right, tell me,
I would
sir.
suggest that it's almost impossible to resolve unless we invade, and I'm talking about with human intelligence, among other means, the territory on which the sightings are made. And
You're not
unless we
talking
can-
about invading the country, sir.
No, I'm not talking about starting World War III, but
Yes,
I'm
sir.
talking about the ability to get back into that territory with trusted agents and find out what the truth is.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgences. I'm not a member of the committee, but as a new member of Congress, very interested in this, General, and very much interested in what you've had to say. Just a quick point, just as an observation. It seems to me that there's been a lot of time, not only by the Congress, various individuals in the intelligence agencies and so forth, in the State Department, either trying to confirm or deny these various reports of live sightings. Even if there were so-called documented, and we all differ as to whether or not they're documented, even if they were documented, the fact of the matter is they would be there. We would have to deal with getting them home, whether they're documented or whether they're not. If that's the issue, getting them home. And I'm just concerned as to what you think the mindset or the motive of the Vietnamese would be. If we assume it's profit or greed or normalization of relations, what would we do differently now by not knowing for sure than if we did know? If we're not willing to go in militarily and find out, then what's changed if we know they're there or they're not there? We could certainly, if we can get people in to find them when we know they're there, we can certainly get people in to look for them when we don't know. So I'm just concerned as to where we ought to be going on this thing. It seems to me we ought to be pursuing the appropriate diplomatic channels here to find out just what the mindset of the Vietnamese or the Laotians is on this subject so that we can deal with it in that manner.
My view is that the efforts that the administration has been successful in establishing some diplomatic discussions with the Hanoi government and viewed as successful would continue to be so, and the opportunities that are available to us to verify and do a lot of other things in dealing with the problem will accelerate dramatically after formal and full diplomatic recognition. And even as it's been suggested by one of your fellow members, that we start with a Cuban-like representation there, gives promise of further ability to discuss in a normal way resolving this issue. Just as in any hostage situation, again, where we have no leverage to start or seem to have no leverage, we've resolved a number of them around the world successfully. And I think we can do that here too. I think the price is much higher and the leverage more difficult. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tai, General Tai, before you leave, just two questions I want to ask you. In response to Mr. Solomon's question, or one of them, you indicated you thought it might indeed be the case that they were holding Americans there as bargaining chips, as it were, for normalization of relations with the United States. Now, if they are holding some of our men, I don't presume to know why they're holding them. I don't preclude the possibility by any means that they have them. But it does strike me as somewhat strange that they would be holding our men as bargaining chips for the purposes of normalizing relations if they're simultaneously denying that they have the bargaining chips. In other words, if presumably what they wanted was for us to recognize them, they would say, look here, we have some of your men, and if you establish normal diplomatic relations, then we'll release them. But if they repeatedly deny that they have them, it doesn't mean their denials are true, but it does suggest that for whatever the motivations may be, they're not related to the desire for normalization.
By the way, their protestations I accept as completely untrue. However, I read into just about every pronouncement that the government, either the foreign minister or the deputy, make in this regard. A tiny little bit of bait held out at the end of each of their statements. And I would suggest they haven't let the issue die at all and will not let it die. And I'd be very surprised if on our next overture, presuming that we're able to go back and with our current negotiations to Hanoi, we're going to get some more remains back at the very least.
Okay, now finally, you've testified today, in effect, that you're convinced that there are Americans in Vietnam or Indochina who are being held there against their will, or at least there were as of a few years ago. And yet I have here before me a transcript of a hearing before this subcommittee in December of 1980. I wasn't chairman at the time, but at that time, in response to a question or in your testimony, you said, and I quote, "There are currently a number of reports on refugee sightings of live POWs that we have extensively investigated and others for which follow-up action has been initiated. However, of all of the live sighting reports DIA has evaluated, there are none which can be substantiated relative to Americans being detained against their will in Southeast Asia."
Yes.
Now that obviously conveys a rather different impression than the impression you've conveyed today, and I wonder if you could square the circle.
Sure. I think the operative word there is substantiated, and I said that in each of the times I appeared here. Being able to prove or substantiate has been impossible unless you can get to the source directly, and I would say the same thing is true today. unless you can actually prove by on-site verification. There's no way that we're going to prove those reports, and there were none in December 80, and I said the same thing in my official testimony on the 25th of June, 1981.
And yet you're convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Americans are being held captive there.
I can only believe that if in the 3 years intervening, if those reports were true there and I had the convictions I had then, that either they've subsequently been found to be false by direct on the scene verification, or indeed we haven't been able to do so.
But would you say that based on the information available to you as of 3 years ago, you were convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that our men were still there?
I was, and so testified here.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to the gentleman.
Before General Tai leaves, General, I just want to clarify one point. You are in favor of establishing a presidential commission.
Very much so.
And I just want to quote you from the fourth paragraph of your statement, where you say the issue is a vital government issue. It must remain the government's issue. Only the government can solve it. Now, you are not suggesting that kind of a commission be a civilian independent commission?
Not at all. Acting directly under and for the president, and with all of the abilities of the various departments of the government available to them.
So it would be a governmental commission?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General Tai. We appreciate, as always, your cooperation. Your testimony has been very helpful.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of June 21, 1984 to me from National Security Advisor Robert McFarland, where the question of a presidential commission, which I requested in 1983, was denied. To quote it, it is not the way to proceed.
Well, without objection, the letter will be included in the record. The administration witnesses are taking their place at the witness table. We'll hear first from Paul Wolfowitz, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs in the Department of State, then James Kelly, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Department of Defense, and from Commodore Thomas Brooks, Assistant Deputy Director for Collection Management in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Mr. Wolfowitz, would you like to get the show on the road? Sorry we're a bit late in getting to you. We've had quite a day, and we're inevitably running somewhat behind schedule.
Mr. Chairman, it's customary for officials that come here to open their statements by expressing pleasure for the occasion. But in truth, I regret very much that 12 years after the U.S. withdrew its forces from Vietnam, it's still necessary for a committee of Congress to discuss efforts to obtain the fullest possible accounting of American servicemen and civilians still missing from that war. If we had received from Hanoi the kind of cooperation that the dictates of humanity and the provisions of the 1973 Paris agreements gave us a right to expect, this issue would long since have been resolved. We have not yet received the level of accelerated cooperation that we seek. It is still necessary for the Congress to take stock periodically on what progress has been made. And it's in that context, but only in that context, that I do appreciate the opportunity to appear before you here today. There's no necessity, I think, for me to reemphasize for you the President's absolute commitment to resolution of this issue. He has made it a matter of highest national priority. who remain missing. We will not rest until we have received the fullest possible accounting of the fate of these heroes. However, if all it took was sweat and dedication by members of the United States government, this issue would long ago have been resolved. What we need to have is the full cooperation of the governments of Vietnam and Laos, and I'd like to report to you today on what has been achieved in the years since we last appeared before you on this subject. First, as to Vietnam, the attitude of the Vietnamese government is, of course, the single most important factor in resolving the fate of our missing men. Hanoi has agreed with us that this is a separate humanitarian issue, not linked to other matters that divide our two countries. Hanoi has also agreed to accelerate cooperation on this issue. Despite some encouraging signs, however, progress thus far is still painfully slow. During the past year, there were several congressional delegations, including one that you led yourself, Mr.